philosophical stand. Mr. Chair?
Paul Goldsmith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look, I think it's worthwhile, as we're working our way through Part 1 of this Act, just to step back and take a look at the broader context. And the European debt crisis remains the biggest threat to the New Zealand economy by some margin. Well, aside from the Labour Party and the Greens, actually, in combination, you're quite right. In particular, we are vulnerable. We are vulnerable to shocks transmitted from Europe through China and Australia and through any tightening of financial markets. And so what goes on in Europe is not an isolated event happening on the other side of the world, but is highly relevant to us. And so, if I could speak generally, this is a very uncertain time for New Zealand and for New Zealand businesses and New Zealand households. And so no one is quite sure what's happening in Europe, no one's quite sure what it means for China and Australia, and confidence levels are quite low, which reinforces how important it is for us to stick to our economic plan. We need to continue to manage government spending, limit debt, and maintain the confidence of financial markets. And that's what this legislation is all about. It's about enabling this government to continue on with its future investment fund and its investment in growing this economy without adding another $5 to $7 billion to our overall levels of debt. And I suppose the question we have to ask the opposition parties is, what are they going to do to get the money in order to make these same sorts of investments? I suppose they do have the option of not spending that $5 to $7 billion in capital investments. I suppose they could just not invest in irrigation, not put money into the high-tech IRD, Crown Research Institutes, not put money into building new schools. Or I suppose they could raise the money from elsewhere. They could stick up a capital gains tax, but of course that doesn't give us any money in the next 10 years. And they could put taxes up on entrepreneurs, but that never works very well. Or they could make us work longer for our superannuation. Or they could just add more debt. They could go out onto volatile international markets and increase the pool of debt that New Zealand already has. And none of those options seem to me very good ones. Before, I would like to debunk some of the comments that have been made about power prices. We hear again and again that somehow privately owned power companies are charging more. Well, it depends how you slice the figures. Certainly the Treasury advises that there are 21 regions listed in the Consumers Institute's Power Switch website. In 14 of those regions, the cheapest electricity company is privately owned. And in one, the cheapest company is owned by the council. In the other 6, the SOE is the cheapest. So it's hardly the most convincing argument I've heard. And when we've got 422,256 customers changing electricity retailers in the annual year, that shows that there is a huge amount of market flexibility going on. I also just wonder about the Greens' objection that once the government sells a minority stake in these companies, governments won't be able to fiddle with those companies quite so easily. They won't be able to get these companies to invest in their pet projects around green technology or something like that because minority owners might object. Well, that's about as good a reason as I can think of to actually go down this path. It seems like an eminently good, sensible reason to be selling partial ownership in these companies, to stop people like Russell Norman fiddling with these companies and making them ineffective and inefficient. And that is the whole purpose of one of the main benefits of having a minority stake owned by the private sector, is it will bring private sector disciplines and good governance to these organisations. And so I'm not worried about not having access to the Ombudsman. I'd far rather have access to the signal sent by market prices in an open market through the continuous disclosure requirements and from market analysts analysing these companies than I would have access to the Ombudsman. So that's why that is a far more effective way of doing things. And it's far better than having Mr Cosgrove and his colleagues in the Finance Committee asking the odd question. I'd far rather have access to continuous disclosure requirements through the stock exchange and the signal that the market price delivers to the quality of these assets. I'm also interested that Mr Parker suggested that the cost structure would be going up under partially privatised companies. I'd love to see some evidence from Mr Parker that shows that state-owned companies have lower cost structures than privately owned companies. I'd love to see some evidence from them to back that claim up. And then we've heard from New Zealand First. Mr Speaker, I'd like to continue. Mr Speaker.
Mr Chair. Thank you very much, Mr Chair. The member who